Hello everyone. In this video you will learn about Chapter 4. Genetic Inheritance. There are 3 subtopics of this chapter. Mendelian genetics, monohybrid and dihybrid. Deviation from Mendelian inheritance. And genetic mapping. Before we discuss in details, let's recall about the genetic materials in an eukaryotic cell. Inside a cell, there is a nucleus. Inside a nucleus, there are chromosomes. Each chromosome is made up of DNA associated with histone protein. Sequence of DNA form a gene. Each gene is made up of nucleotide base pairs. There are few terms that you must know to help you understand more about this chapter. First is gene. Gene is a basic hereditary unit consisting of a sequence of DNA that occupies a specific location on a chromosome. For example, this is a gene that codes for hair color. In a homologous chromosome, one gene comes from father, and one from mother. Allele is the alternative forms of the same genes that occupy the same locus of homologous chromosome, usually in alphabets form. Meanwhile, locus is the specific position of a gene or allele on a chromosome. Let's look at this diagram. Allele will be used as alternative form for the gene. Therefore, this gene consists 2 alleles, located at the same locus of homologous chromosomes. Here is another example. The gene consists 2 alleles. The 2 alleles are located at specific location or locus of homologous chromosomes. There are 2 types of allele: dominant allele and recessive allele. Dominant allele is an allele that is expressed when present in either homozygous or heterozygous condition. It determines dominant characteristic and usually represented by capital letter. Meanwhile, recessive allele is an allele that is expressed when in homozygous condition but being hidden in heterozygous condition. It determines recessive characteristic, usually represented by small letter. For example, paternal allele H for hair color. Capital letter H is dominant allele. It determines black hair color. So, black hair is dominant characteristic. Meanwhile, for maternal allele H for hair color, small letter h is recessive allele. It determines blonde hair color. So, blonde hair is recessive characteristic. A single allele cannot express the characteristic. Only in a pair of allele, the characteristic can be expressed. A gene consists of a pair of allele. There are more than one possibility condition of alleles combination in a gene, where it can be in homozygous or heterozygous. Homozygous condition is when a gene has identical alleles. There are 2 possibilities of homozygous condition, which are homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. Homozygous dominant condition is when both allele are dominant allele. Meanwhile, homozygous recessive condition is when both allele are recessive allele. Heterozygous condition is when a gene has different alleles, which is combination of dominant and recessive allele. One gene or a pair of allele will determines the characteristic of an individual. A gene can be in homozygous dominant condition, homozygous recessive condition, or heterozygous condition. So, homozygous dominant condition will express black hair. Homozygous recessive condition will express blonde hair. Meanwhile, for heterozygous condition, the recessive allele is masked by dominant allele. Therefore, heterozygous condition will express dominant characteristic, which is black hair. These form of genes are known as genotype. Genotype is the genetic constituent of an organism. Meanwhile, the hair color is known as phenotype. Phenotype is the observable characteristic of an organism. Based on the term of phenotype, we can say that Father's hair phenotype is black, meanwhile mother's hair phenotype is blonde. Based on the term of genotype, we can say that father's hair genotype can be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, meanwhile, mother's hair genotype is homozygous recessive. You also must know what is the definition of true breeding or pure breeding, self-cross, and test cross. True breeding or pure breeding is an individual with homozygous genotype either dominant or recessive, meaning that both allele in a gene are identical. Self-cross is a cross between individuals of the same generation. For example, between two individuals of first generation. Test cross is a cross between an individual of dominant phenotype, but unknown genotype, with a homozygous recessive individual. Test cross is used to test whether the dominant phenotype is homozygous or heterozygous. For example, a white flower. White is recessive phenotype. So white is homozygous recessive condition. Meanwhile for a purple flower, purple is dominant phenotype. The genotype of purple has two possibilities condition, which is homozygous dominant condition or heterozygous condition. By using test cross, we can determine the genotype of the purple flower. In test cross, we will cross a homozygous recessive individual which is the white flower, with the dominant phenotype individuals but unknown genotype, which is purple. If the crossing produce all purple offspring, the genotype of purple is homozygous dominant. Meanwhile, if the crossing produce half of offspring are purple and half are white, the genotype of purple is heterozygous.